Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure, which is a very wide net that I cast, I have to admit, when it comes to topics, but it allows me to stretch into other areas that are related in some ways to those topics, but also are sort of hovering on the fringe. And it seems to be working pretty well. I wanted to thank all of you who listen to my podcast. I just broke 100,000 downloads last week. I'm very excited. That's a big number for me. I've been doing this for almost 10 years, but that number of 100,000 downloads, rather, is reflective of only the last 2 years. So I'm very excited to see people are picking up on the show and listening to it. It makes me very happy. With that in mind, I want to get right into our topic. We have a fantastic guest here, someone I met probably 7 or 8 years ago in an interview with my wife at the time, and we did a discussion about her book on spells, but she's back today with me today. Her name is Judika Illes, and she has just published the book called The Fantastic and Forgotten, Tales of Supernatural, Strange, and Bizarre. So this is a wonderful topic, I think. Judika, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on again.
Thank you, Chris. I always love doing your show. Yeah. And congratulations.
Yeah, I know it's a big milestone for me. I'm kind of excited.
It's a huge milestone.
I'm really
That's
excited.
amazing. That's great.
It really is. Yeah, thank you.
And deserved.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. So this book is really caught my eye as soon as I saw it. It said The Fantastic and Forgotten.
Yeah.
Tales of the Supernatural, Strange, and Bizarre. And you are the editor behind this. You collated all these stories. It's sort of a compendium of wildly bizarre stories written over the centuries that dip into all kinds of great, what I would call spooky ghost stories in some ways,
They're
right?
spooky stories. They're weird tales. Yeah. So, no, it's a little bit of a departure for me.
Yes, it is.
I mean, what I have published up until now is metaphysical nonfiction, spells and saints and spirits and witches, but all nonfiction. And I was very grateful for the opportunity to essentially curate this collection, because it's metaphysical fiction and real vintage classic, often written by people who knew what they were talking about. And I had so much fun doing it and fun reading it.
I can imagine. I can only imagine. But I have to say, of the 18 stories that are in here, I am wondering how you went about picking them. I mean, that must have been a difficult process in itself, right? I mean, you had to have some parameters.
Back in the day, in one of my previous incarnations in this lifetime, I was a disc jockey. Okay. Back in the days of freeform radio, where a disc jockey was expected to, you picked your own music, and you had to keep your listeners, and it's a delicate balance of giving people the familiar and, introducing them to what they don't know and sort of setting a rhythm. And so this was to me a very similar experience where, you can't have, there are 18 stories in this book, and they can't all be obscure, because no one will, people won't, if the 18 authors that no one has ever heard of, odds are they're not going to pick up the book. Right. So, I mean, we have a little bit of the greatest hits of this type of fiction.
Yeah.
We've got,
I love that idea of the radio. Really does ring a bell for me, because it's kind of very similar to that, and I miss those days. I'll tell you the truth. The old radio days.
Me too. And you would tune in because you knew a specific disc jockey had good taste, or liked things that you liked, or introduced you to things you would like. So it's sort of a combination of familiar authors. The book starts with a Bram Stoker story that apparently was originally intended to be in the novel Dracula, but was removed. And it's a standalone story. If there's somebody out there who's not familiar with Dracula, you can read the story anyway, you'll understand it. Apparently Bram Stoker's widow, following his death, was a little hard up for money and published some of the outtakes. And it's a great story, Dracula's Guest. And there's the original story of the monkey's paw, which I talk about that story all the time, and its message of being careful what you wish for.
Right.
And over the years, I've been so surprised at how many people don't realize that it was a work of fiction, written by this man, W. Jacobs. They assume it's some sort of a folk tale. Or they've only seen, the parodies, like the Simpsons parody.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to actually include the actual story. And then there were stories I couldn't use. There is an earlier, this book is in a series, and the earlier series was curated by Lon Milo Duquette. And I'm going to tell you, he has a story in there that I would have wanted to use. He had a quote in there that I would have wanted to use, but he got there first.
Oh, I see, yeah. But, I think it's good that you've done it this way because, I think, and I'm going to come back to that parallel you made of being a disc jockey again, because oftentimes I've been a disc jockey myself as well. What you would do, you'd play a familiar song people would recognize, sort of get them hooked in, and then introduce them to other songs along the way, and then spice up that set list, for example, with different nuggets that no one knew about. And it was a great way of bringing new music to people. This is the same that you've done here, because there are Bram Stoker is in here, Oscar Wilde's in here, Charles Dickens is in here, Edgar Allan Poe. Those people you might expect. At least you'd always expect Poe to be in a book like this, but you might not expect Charles Dickens. And then, of course, all the other ones you bring in as well, who are just phenomenal writers.
I knew I wanted a Marie Corelli story because she is truly forgotten, and I read her as a child. I mean, I'm still, but I learned how to read very young. My mother taught herself English by teaching me how to read, and I could learn. And I am a voracious reader. I will read anything you put in front of me, and I was, my only sibling is 12 years older than I am.
Interesting. So you spent a lot of time by yourself probably when you were younger.
I spent a lot of time by myself.
And therefore you spent your time in a book.
I spent my time, exactly, and listening to music.
Yeah, what a great way. I was the same. My sister was 6 years older than me, so I had a similar kind of thing. I spent a lot of time doing the exact same thing.
Yeah. But, I read what was in the house, which were mainly adult books. And I read Marie Corelli, for those who don't know her, was Queen Victoria's favorite author. Winston Churchill read her. She, in some ways, she sold more books in her time than Arthur Conan Doyle. She was.
That is fascinating.
I don't know if she was a Danielle Steele or the J.K. Rowling or some combination of her time. And I would say most of her books are out of print, if not all of them. And she's really post World War I. I think, kind of just killed her career.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
But
she was really a very popular writer. So she's probably along the lines of an Agatha Christie, perhaps, or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. And her specialty were these very heightened emotional, they're very lush, romantic, spiritual books. The book that I read as a child, Ziska, is a reincarnation romance that takes place in Egypt, in sort of colonial Egypt. And I mean, it is like something you can imagine Hercule Poirot in the midst of the people in her novel. And I just, to this day, I love a reincarnation romance.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wellspring of place. It gives you an awful lot of freedom, I think, as a writer, because you can extend yourself into anywhere you want to go. And it certainly is a limited audience, perhaps. Although I think that probably is growing over the years. I think people are becoming more and more fascinated with this sort of topic.
Yes, and I think it's interesting because some of these authors, like Marie Corelli, were quite popular in their own time. Hans Heinz Ewers, who was known as the German Edgar Allan Poe, he translated Poe. I have one of his stories in here also. They were very popular at that time, but have over the decades just fallen totally from favor, and that's juxtaposed with someone like H.P. Lovecraft,
right,
who was not popular during his time, who received no respect, very little money during his time, and now there are Library of Congress editions of his work, and scholarly discussions of the Lovecraftian mythos. It's fascinating.
I mean, it's a shame in some ways that these authors don't recognize that fame while they're alive, but it's also fascinating to see how they sort of come into these pockets of influence where people all of a sudden are very into them and very popular writers. Did you have a time span that you were trying to work within?
Well, yes, because, and you will see this in quite a lot of anthologies of stories. I mean, everything in this, you can be very frank, although I'm sure some reviewers have already pointed out, everything, other than my own work, and I write the introduction to the book.
Right.
And I think I bring a different perspective than the average anthology of this type of material, because I am an occultist.
Right, of course.
And and I don't, for me, this isn't just sort of laughable, goofy stuff. I recognize the authentic metaphysical information that some of these stories contain, but everything was within the public domain. So in the United States, I mean, that means everything has to be published before 1923.
Oh, I see. Interesting.
So it does, because anthologies where you have, it is a different, I mean, these are publishing technicalities, but when you publish modern fiction, it becomes, and it's often why you will see modern anthologies have authors maybe who are less well known, because once it becomes difficult, it would be difficult to do what I have done with out of the public domain material.
Right, you couldn't have gotten the bigger names in there had you not. I mean, being outside of the public domain, you're allowed to publish things like Poe, because they're past. What is it? What's the time frame? Is it?
In the U.S., it's 1923. It's different in different countries. Our rules are a little more stringent than some places.
Of course, then that gets into the copyright aspects and the royalties and all that, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes.
So you're not tucked away and you're under a pseudonym, are you?
No. Although I'm speaking, I do write fiction, and it's how I sort of started as a fiction writer. It's an interesting. I had an interesting year last year. I actually published one of my own poems in an anthology. There's an anthology called Corpse Roads that was put out by the folk horror group it's on Facebook, but I mean, it's sort of taken on a life of its own. It's this huge group, and they put out anthologies that all proceeds will go to charity. They go to wildlife charities.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
Yeah, it is. And so, the authors are not paid, and I contributed a poem for the, it is the first time in many decades that I've had any poetry published, so that was interesting. And I'm actually speaking with someone now. I've promised someone a short story for another anthology. So, life is interesting.
It is. When you look at these stories, were you surprised to find someone such as, a Charles Dickens or a Yeats dipping their pen into this well, so to speak?
Yeats, no. Charles Dickens, yes. I knew William Butler Yeats was a member of the Golden Dawn and was very involved with folklore and with the magical
Was he a Mason?
arts.
Was he a Mason by chance?
I don't know if he was a Mason, but he was a member of the Golden Dawn. I believe that several of these authors were Masons, and several members of the Golden Dawn, which was this pivotally important, for people who are not familiar, pivotally important esoteric society in the beginning in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, and so I knew that William Butler Yeats, and I know his work very well, so that did not surprise me. Charles Dickens, on the other hand, I thought I knew his work. I thought The Christmas Carol was, which I love, was his only ghost story. only to discover that he encouraged other people to write ghost stories. He published anthologies, including his own work. Every year around Christmas, he would publish anthologies. He has a lot of supernatural stories.
Interesting.
I didn't get the stories also. I mean, there are all kinds of parameters. I wanted to get a certain number of stories in here, so they had to be a certain length.
Right. I was going to say you're probably bound by that, because there probably are some short novellas or something like that are just a little bit too long.
There are wonderful novellas, but once you publish one of them, you have less room, because there is a Nathaniel Hawthorne, House of the Seven Gables,
right?
And
yeah,
Scarlet Letter, also wrote wonderful supernatural fiction. And Rappaccini's Daughter, if you haven't read it, it is about poisonous plants, and it's great.
Interesting.
Yeah, Rappaccini's Daughter. And I would have liked to have included something from him in this book, and maybe it'll turn up in a future book.
It's interesting. I heard this years ago. Maybe you could substantiate it. Were writers paid by the length of their works back then? I mean, in this era?
There were people who were paid by the minute, the way that there
paid
were
by the
people
word.
who were paid by the minute, paid by the word. Yes, a word a minute.
Yeah, paid by the word. So therefore, they were more inclined to write longer books. They would actually, because they'd get more money for them. So probably the short story wasn't probably that well known back then, let alone an obscure weird tale.
Some of them are very long. I read aloud a lot, and I read several of the Charles Dickens novels. Oliver Twist, and my favorite is Great Expectations. When I read them all out loud to my children, and who were very patient, and we read aloud all the time, and they did not have patience for Dickens. And I really had to analyze. Well, what he does, and you have to think of him in the context of his time. There was no TV, there was no movies. He's almost very cinematic in the way he writes. He describes everything. So he wants you to see what he's talking about.
Right. And see, and I think we've evolved to he probably had to write by candlelight, if he did at night at all, and or oil lamp at least. And for those, you really do need to spend time setting the stage setting. You've got to spend the time with all those details, because we are so exposed to so much data that we can easily short circuit some of this. Or we can shorten that discussion process up. And I've often heard that in fiction classes that I take, that you spend too much time describing, get to the story, because there's a certain sense of impatience there. People want to get in there faster. But I enjoy that, and interestingly, I was doing the same thing with my kids, and just the other day I picked up Grapes of Wrath and I started to read it. And I couldn't believe how long the descriptive passages were. It was just out of my purview, my recent purview at least. So. Yeah,
it's a different. I think it's almost a different way of perceiving the world, and a different way of relating to literature or our expectations. We don't expect authors to tell us everything anymore. We can
it's just not the case.
Ourselves in our heads.
Yeah, I hear all the time, show, don't tell. And this
me too.
Yeah, you're showing too much.
I'm an editor. It's what I tell people all the time too. Show, it's the best. It is really the best advice I ever got when I was, first getting published. Show, don't tell.
Yeah, and it's a hard line to cross sometimes. But I think that, it is indicative of the culture at the time that we are writing. If you're writing now, you're going to have a much different experience writing than you would have back then. Of course, they were using pens and writing everything written out in longhand, many cases, and it's just a completely different experience. Now we could write a book on our phones if we wanted to, I suppose.
and people do.
People do, yeah.
I suspect.
There's a good that would actually be a good compendium, as written on my phone, and it'd be like flash fiction,
And you can only read it on your phone.
Only read it on your phone, and it had to be the equivalent of one page, or there'd be a character limit of some sort, like a tweet.
I may be too old for that.
Twitter, we can call it Twitter literature.
Yeah.
Twitlet, yeah, exactly. It's funny, but I think that what also is compelling about these stories, aside from the fantastic and the forgotten title and the wonderful ideas that you use to draw them together, is the fact that they were from another place and time, which I think adds a real sense of mystique to them. I think it makes them even scarier in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Although the one that I find the scariest personally is The Guest by Lord Dunsany, which hypothetically could occur at any time. And that is the shortest story in here. It's a tiny itty-bitty little story. You know what, when I go to stores to do events, sometimes I read it out loud because it is so short. And it's very precise, and it is both precise and vague. Often people don't get what happens at the end, or what's going on.
And that is a real talent to be able to write that economically and to get across that stuff so quickly with such power and.
And I don't want to give away the story.
No, don't. No,
so it's an itty bitty story. There's not a lot to tell. It is what it is. But it could. That story is not. It's not rooted to any time or or place.
Yeah, I like that.
It clearly it is written it's taking place in turn of the century London, but it could just as easily be turn of this century New York or San Francisco.
That is fascinating. I've always thought that the stories that scared me the most were the ones that had the most foundation in reality to them. I was always scared to death of Norman Bates and Psycho. It just terrified me to death because I could actually see that happening. And Hitchcock was a master of tapping into that because he would play with these things that were feasible, very tangible to believe, and then put that twist on them just enough that would, it still
Vertigo.
scares me. Vertigo, exactly.
I somehow watched Vertigo a lot in the last couple months. I've been rewatching. It's a movie I had a hard time liking.
Yeah, I had the same problem with it, to be honest.
I did not love that movie, and then my son put it on TV, and I walked into the room in the middle of it and was surprised at how much I liked it. And I've watched it twice more since then.
Wow.
I don't know. Maybe I have to get to
I think a lot of
appreciate it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is Hitchcock himself. I think he has the way he does things and sets up scenes is just he's almost
a master.
He's almost no one comes close to him really.
No. His work is both so detailed and succinct, and he's a master of sleight of hand, and it's just, you just watch them over and over again. So, I mean, the best movies that he's done, the ones that I enjoy the most, I watch them over and over again.
Yeah, and his television series, interestingly enough, a lot of his stories were written by Roald Dahl, of all people.
Yes.
Is it one of his great sources for information for plots and stuff came from Roald Dahl, and I've always been a huge fan of that. And so it's interesting because you had to. I'm wondering what your thought process was in going through this. I mean, you had a time barrier. You had you couldn't write publish things before a certain time, after a certain time rather.
Right.
And so you had to do that, and you wanted to get a couple of big names in there, so you'd have some juicy stuff to pull people through. And
I wanted to make sure to represent some women writers also.
That was good, yeah. I love that.
Which I'm working on a follow-up now, which will have more women authors.
Oh, good.
There is a sort of it's almost like putting together the pieces of a puzzle when you're doing, because although, they have to be a certain length in order to get a certain amount of stories. I don't know that there is so much. I mean, the theme of Fantastic and Forgotten was given to me, but the other thing was, I don't know, 2000. When this was written, it was a hard time for me. Just not. It wasn't a bad year, but just emotionally, it was sort of a hard time, and I wasn't in the mood for anything disgusting.
Huh. Interesting.
And so that was also that I went through a lot of stories. I was looking for a certain tone.
So you avoided the gore, for example.
I avoided the gore. There is a shadow side to some of these stories. There's a lot of, some of them express, they're products of their time, and they're very casual with the racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, misogyny. And I wanted people to be, this is not an academic book where let's read all of Lovecraft and, we'll discuss, his pros and cons. I wanted people to be able to enjoy this book.
Yeah. And I think it taps into an area people are fascinated with this because it does give us, it steps into the realm of the unknown. And there's that.
Yes.
And of course, in a short story, you've always got to have that a possibility, exactly. You've always got to have that hook at the end.
Yes, because it's not necessarily their fiction. And in some cases, they're fiction because some of the authors were metaphysical masters. Dion Fortune, Algernon Blackwood as well. The Woman's Ghost Story to me is, I think, one of the best stories in here, and it's very real.
That's the secret. I think when the story becomes real and then it gets twisted to sort of play with our heads and our emotions in that way where we enter into a different realm, that is the real challenge. And that's the beauty of a well-written story, of course, is to bring people in and get that. And but I think to be scared and to be sort of get that little tingle, that little childlike tingle we get when we read a story like this it's a fascinating. And
I wanted to vary. Remember. I didn't want 18 murder stories or 18 ghost stories. So there are ghost stories and vampire stories, and there's a couple of witch stories. The W.B. Yeats story has to do with fairies, and not necessarily Tinkerbell, cute little fairies. They're all a little different, and then you have the monster tales of Lovecraft and Robert W. Chambers, and I had watched True Detective season 1 not long before I had started working on this. And for people, you don't need to know any of these things in order to enjoy that program. This is the series with Woody Harrelson and Matthew McConaughey. But there are a lot of references, in particular to the work of Robert Chambers, and it made me go back and read the book again, and I wanted to include something from there. So we have the yellow sign in the book.
Yeah, when you look at some of the better known writers that you've mentioned, now obviously we know Bram Stoker. He's famous for being the Dracula person, so you'd expect that. But someone like Dickens. Did you think that they were experimenting with this genre, or was it just sort of a way of them flexing their muscles to see if they could write this way?
Dickens loved ghost stories, and Dickens had loved ghost stories since he was a child, and his nanny scared the pants off of him by telling him stories.
And it left a mark in him. He never recovered, and that's why he.
One of the things I talk about in the introduction is, going farther back than the 19th century, the concept of seasonal stories, that the winter season, and especially in the northern hemisphere, it's the time where you can't really work outside anymore, and it's the time where ghost stories are told.
Yes, perfect time.
And it's believed that all these sort of spiritual entities, the Wild Hunt, and ancestral spirits, and I guess if you're in the wilds of Canada, the Wendigo, all these beings walk.
Yeah, they all become heightened, I think, at the time of year. I think because we're hibernating. It's darker. But also, I think back in the day, at the time these stories were written, the written word was actually the best was the most common form of entertainment for families.
Yes.
I mean, they had no radio, obviously, and we've sort of lost that. And
but this is even going back earlier. This is going back for centuries and centuries. This concept of that there are stories that you tell, and there are stories as a spiritual art, and so many, let's say, fairy tales come out of women's spinning rooms.
Yeah.
Because they would have somebody while people were spinning, they would get somebody to tell the stories.
And that's where they call it spinning a yarn.
Spinning a yarn, yes. They would have somebody to keep people awake and to keep people focused. And so you would have certain kinds of stories for the spinning room, and you have certain types of stories. And Charles Dickens was very aware of that. And the BBC every year has a Christmas story.
Yes. Yeah.
And which is often some sort of a suspenseful or ghost story. And he was very conscious of himself as being in that tradition and trying to maintain and vitalize that tradition. And so I think Charles Dickens, I think he was quite confident of his ability to spin a yarn.
Yeah. Yeah, I think,
And
having a
he
mind
did
like
these for
that.
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Having a mind.
Yeah, I think these were fun for him. He apparently, I learned, I always learn a lot when I'm writing.
Mm-hmm.
Because I always go digging for the research. I didn't know he was sort of among the first celebrity authors. He went and did readings, public readings.
Mm.
He enjoyed the interaction with an audience.
Interesting. It really is. It really, you can see how it can take off, especially in a mind like his with that deep imagination. Yeah. We're speaking today with Judika Illes. She is the editor and the compiler of this fantastic new book called The Wiser Book of the Fantastic and Forgotten, Tales of the Supernatural, Strange, and Bizarre. We're going to take a quick break. He'll be right back, but check out the book. It's called The Fantastic and the Forgotten, Tales of the Supernatural, Strange, and Bizarre. And her last name is Illes, Illes. You can find it, I'm sure, at all of your favorite book outlets. And we'll be back in a few minutes to continue our conversation, so hang in there.
What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today. Or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed.
As the world shrinks and our barriers come down, diverse cultures are striving for harmony, balance, and peace. To ease the transition, we need to expand with color, light, and tolerance. Now, you can become a global citizen and embrace the color and clear spirit with the divine artwork of the mandala. Mandalas are a timeless artistic offering for creating unity, harmony, and peace. My name is Chris Flisher, and I've spent years creating mandalas, and they are now available online at www.turningofthewheel.com. Come and experience the world of color, form, and function with t-shirts, coffee mugs, note cards, and limited edition prints. These vibrant, lively paintings and products express optimism, oneness, and spiritual balance for all who use them. www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. And enter a world of possibility and color.
Okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. Today we're speaking with Judika Illes. She is the editor and the compiler of The Wiser Book of the Fantastic and Forgotten, Tales of the Supernatural, Strange, and Bizarre. It is a collection of 18 stories by some very famous, well-known authors and some not so well-known. But the common thread between them all is this I don't know, a deeply evocative, kind of mysterious realm of the supernatural and the forbidden, this realm that sounds like, the one that tantalizes most of us the most. It gives us that sense of fear and yet excitement, what's behind that door, and that sort of that childlike tension that we get. And they think these stories bring that out very clearly, especially in this format. They're all short stories, they're not long. And to come from authors such as, W.B. Yeats and Charles Dickens and Bram Stoker and, of course, Edgar Allan Poe is represented here, but many others not so well known, as we were talking about in the first half, particularly Marie Corelli, who I would never have known who she was had it not been for this book. So I appreciate that much.
And that's so fascinating because in her time, she was so well known. And, you see people you assume will never be forgotten.
And yet they were.
Within just a few decades. Even though they are all published before 1923, it's not, in the scope of time, it's not that long ago. None of the stories are... these stories aren't... The book that I'm working on now, I'm working on another anthology that will be out, I believe, in October of 2017, and I've arranged those in order of date of publication. I didn't do that with this book, but none of them are super old, if you think about it, and yet so much has changed.
Did you think that? Yeah, it certainly has. Did you think that how much effort, or what was your decision-making process in going through the order for of the way the stories are laid out in the book, as well as sort of what was your process trying to gather these? This is the real
I know
mystery.
You usually talk about astrology, so I will tell you. I do have a prominent sixth house.
Okay, very good.
And I am, and it's all in the details. I did rearrange. I rearranged the stories quite a bit.
Sure
I wanted to begin and end with the equivalent of, as we were talking earlier about a radio set. I wanted to sort of begin and end with something popular, and so the brackets are the Bram Stoker story and the Monkey's Paw, and then in between, I don't know, I played with it a lot. I wanted Edgar Allan Poe and Hans Heinz Ewers to be close together. I know it sounds crazy, but a lot of thought did actually go into that.
Oh, I'm sure it did. I think it sounds like a lot of fun, actually. But I can imagine, trying to weave some sort of theme to bring people along as you would, like just your album. The way you talk about the DJ is a perfect analogy for this. It's sort of like lining up songs to play. So one leads into the other.
I like all these stories. This is somewhat a labor of love. I really like these stories, and I wanted to showcase them. To show them at their best, and in the hopes that other people would like them as well. These stories have brought me a lot of pleasure. Whatever I write, I read everything aloud as I write it. Like I go back before I send it in. All my books, my huge encyclopedias, I read them all out loud because I can sometimes hear a mistake.
It's very true.
More than,
it's a great,
your
great
eyes
technique.
After a while, your eyes start swimming, but I can hear it. And I have read every single story in here, not only to myself, but out loud 2 or 3 times.
You almost have to.
And they hold up.
Yeah, you have to read it out loud. I think because that's the only way to really constructively self-edit.
Yeah.
It's very difficult otherwise. I think that when you read them, they do take on a different luster. A certain tone is there. I think you can... I tend to read quickly, and sometimes I read too quickly because I'm so anxious to get to the story and what's going on. Sometimes I'm a little bit too hasty. When I read aloud, it forces you to slow down. And
forces you to slow down.
And I like that about
But sometimes I read fast and then I go back and I read it again. Because sometimes you just, especially if it's a mystery, you want to know what happens.
Well, you want to know. That's what I'm saying. You get pulled into the story. You're like, what's happening? And you miss you might miss a key ingredient on the way if you run too quickly.
Books I love, especially fiction, but other, nonfiction too. Books I love, I tend to go back and reread them. I think it's a good. But there are so many books in the world. So many
little
books,
time.
So little time. Yeah,
exactly. I know. It's
fun. We all have to take good care of ourselves because there are a lot of books to read.
That's right. Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. And the more we read, I think that what I'm encouraged by is the fact that that publishing is still around. I thought for sure it was going to disappear, and I'm overjoyed by the fact because the experience that one gets when one reads is so much different than watching a television show or anything else. They both have their place in our world, and we have to recognize them both. But I think the literature, the written word, is such an important thing. Of course, my mother was a librarian, so I've got a genetic bias, I suppose. But
right.
I still think that there's something about that, and it's the tactile quality as well. I don't really like reading on a electronic device. It does not work for me, and so having the book in my hands and being able to sit in bed and read it or wherever, I just think it's one of the greatest.
The flipping of the pages. I do have digital books too because I travel, and sometimes on a plane or on a bus.
I know, it does make sense. It does.
Convenient.
Yeah.
But you can't flip the pages. You can't go back. It's different.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually have a funny story for you. When I graduated from college, and this is back in the early 1980s, I wanted to go into publishing. And I knew someone who had an in, and I, went to see her, and she told me to forget about it. Publishing was dying.
Wow.
And now, meanwhile, in the last couple of years, I've got to work for a publisher. So I took a very circuitous route to get here, but
you
it's
got
very
here.
funny.
That's the long and the short. You did get here.
I took the circuitous mountain route,
Mm-hmm.
but back in the 80s, and this woman was, I think she told me that sincerely. I think she wasn't blowing me off. They were already ringing the death knells, and yet here we are. And I think publishing has certainly taken twists and turns and changes, but I don't think it's going anywhere. I think people need books.
I do too. I don't think it's going anywhere either. I mean, they say that book sales are up in some demographics across the country, even though the bookstores are closing. Although I heard a very unsettling thing the other day. A local bookstore in my town closed about 2 months ago. Very disappointing to see it go. And then I heard that Amazon was opening a bookstore in a town probably 30 miles from here. And I'm thinking, wow, Amazon comes along, kills the business, and then rebuilds it all again. I guess it's just, and I'm an Amazon fan. I mean, it's convenient. I can't help it, but it still gets me.
I think there
the
were a
books.
lot of factors. I mean, I grew up in and around New York City, and New York City. I moved to California, came back in 2001, and there were still so many bookstores.
Yeah.
And now there's so few left. And they're very precious. But I don't think we can blame the online booksellers in this case. I think it's, I think it's the evil landlords who just raise the rent so high that, because it's not just the bookstores. Pearl River, which was this Chinese department store that was.
Oh, I remember that place. That was fabulous.
I loved.
Well, I never walked out of there empty-handed.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And it's gone. This sort of killing the goose with the golden eggs.
It is a shame. I do bemoan them disappearing, but I think it also has to come down to a supply and demand. People have to be more inclined to read. I think that by reintroducing these kinds of books, there's a certain mystique here that plays right into the hands. I've got children, and my sons are all into this topic, and I could easily see them going towards this. It's a generational thing.
Yeah, I'm always asked, like, are your books, I get a lot of, around the holidays, I get a lot of emails from grandmothers, my grandson has asked me to buy, the Encyclopedia of 5,000 Spells, is it appropriate? And I never really know what to say, because, my parents certainly would have let me read it, but I know other people who wouldn't, but I'm glad I have a couple titles, including this one, that I can say, I think this is pretty safe.
Yeah.
There is, it's all classic fiction.
It's been properly vetted. It's gone through the right channels. It's it's age appropriate. It
was good enough for 1900. I guess it's good enough for now.
Absolutely. They lived under much different times. My gosh, if you can get by in Victorian England, you can get by in anything, I imagine.
The violence isn't graphic.
Yeah.
The sex isn't graphic. The language isn't overly graphic. So.
But in some ways, I actually like that, because I think it forces us to use our imagination more.
Yeah.
Which is
Definitely.
really, and I think the real joy of literature is pulling you in so that you have to sort of put things together yourself. It really is it's an iterative kind of exchange between you and the book. You have to enter in.
Yeah.
Which is why I always will read a book before I see the movie.
Me too.
Just because I want to have that character in my head.
And sometimes if I really like the book, I won't see the movie.
Yeah, I know, because it might destroy it for you. I understand that completely. Yeah.
It's almost like gaslighting. After a while, you don't see your own image. You see what someone has put in front of you.
Right. Yeah. It
and
is.
I've never seen the movie of The Silence of the Lambs because I didn't really see it in my head.
Yeah, interesting. That's a tough one, I have to say.
Yeah, although you have things like The Shining, where the book and the movie are so totally different.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
And
I
I like both.
They both have their own quality. Yes, they
Yes.
do. But I think that ultimately I prefer to read the book first, just to get that graphic idea in my head, to understand who the characters are, to sort of formulate my own opinion. And oftentimes the directors don't match up with my interpretation, which is always leaves me a little bit off. But that's just me. Maybe my
and Hitchcock, was a master of that. I don't know if you've ever. Most people haven't. I went back to read the material that The Birds is based on, which is I don't remember who the author is, but it almost has no, other than some birds, it almost has no resemblance to the movie. And you realize, he took this material as inspiration and just went with it.
Right. Well, I can almost see why that would work in his case, because I don't think you could write a story as compelling as The Birds. I'm sure it was done. I'm sure that it was a good spot. The story
it's based on is very mysterious and sort of vague. And he did, I guess, keep that in terms of, why are these birds behaving like this?
Right.
But the whole, it doesn't take place in California. None of the characters appear in the story. It's totally different. And I really enjoyed both of them, and I admire so much what he did with that material.
Well, he certainly knew
how.
He certainly knew how to get us scared and to get us interested and present things that I don't even know how he got the ideas of what made us scared. But he had a certain knack for it that I think has never been really replicated by anybody.
Because he had a lot of fears. I had this very interesting conversation with Whitley Strieber, where he I'm a person who has faced a lot of fears and has gotten over most of them. And he was jokingly calling me the Queen of Fear. But it's not entirely a joke. But Hitchcock also was a person, if you read about him, who a lot of things made him very nervous, to say the least.
Right.
And I think I think he was able to transmit that into his visual work. But he also at least put his name on anthologies of stories that are great stories.
Yeah, no. I know he had a lot of fears. I know he was certainly a very unusual man to begin with. I don't think you could do what he has done and not have a little bit of something off kilter there. But he does get right to the core of the fears, and it's just the simple things that he does, the way camera angles he uses and stuff like that just draw out that. And I think that he would be someone who would love a book such as this, because he would say, there's a story in there somewhere. And even if it was just a short vignettes. And I would encourage, I think this is a great place for people to look. People who are interested in making films these days, look at these kind of sources as potential movies. What would it be like to create a movie, or even a short little, a YouTube thing on one of these stories? Wouldn't it be a great exercise in, pushing your imagination in a certain way? And, we have all the tools, we can do it. And we can do it right in our backyard right now these days, in our home with our phones. You can do the whole thing very simply. And it'll be fun to try that, I think. This is a great source for that. I'm going to have to ask you this, because you know that it's inevitable for me to ask you this, and you probably prepare for this, but you have to have at least one favorite in here.
I think I have many favorites, and
like having children, you can't have a favorite.
I will tell you, in some ways, I like them all. I think the one that I really love, it's not the scariest story, but it's the one that's very dear to my heart, is A Water Witch by H.D. Everett, and The Woman's Ghost Story by Algernon Blackwood. If you ask me what are the two scariest stories for me, it's The Guest by Lord Dunsany and The Spider by Hans Heinz Ewers. But A Water Witch and The Woman's Ghost Story, they're eerie stories, and maybe somebody else will find that. I don't find ghosts I don't find ghosts and witches scary in general. I find people scary.
I do too. Yeah.
So that sort of supernatural aspect in general. The Hans Heinz Ewers one, to me, I went looking for that story because I'd read it before, and it is a scary story. But there's something very compassionate about those stories, and it's the narrator of A Water Witch is a no-nonsense woman who would call herself a rationalist and starts the story. She's, she doesn't have patience for things like ghosts or supernatural things. So it is the story of what happens in a sort of classic haunted house and haunted area, but it's the evolution of the narrator. And you can, by the end of the story, having encountered some unexpected phenomena, she becomes a kinder person, a kinder and more patient person. And I think it's so well written.
So there's that little moral nugget that you have to get at the end of the story that sort of pulls you through.
Yeah, although it's subtle. I mean, it's not an Aesop's fable. It's not, but it is. I mean, there's sort of a lot. Some of these stories, in their brevity, there's a lot going on.
Mm-hmm. That's the challenge of the short story, is to pack a lot of information into a small area and make it compelling and pull you along, and still leave. They usually have to have some either hook into them that is very unexpected, or you've got to have some sort of moral, value or something that's passed on as a result of the story. You've got to learn something from it, or you've got to stop and say, interesting, what would I do in a situation like that?
And also to have enough content, have enough depth, I guess, to hold up to repeated reading.
Yeah.
The literature, in this type of literature in particular, was often dismissed as sort of disposable. In the way that people would read, people read newspapers and toss them away. And, people often, it's assumed that people read comic books that way. And this sort of supernatural literature was, certainly at that time, was perceived in that way. And yet, clearly these are stories that the authors thought about, took a lot of care with. There's, a lot of character development in A Water Witch. It's got some humor in it. It's, I as a writer and as a reader, I do appreciate it.
Yeah, that's a difficult combination to nail down and to have it be compelling at the same time. Writing is not an easy task. It's very enjoyable. I write a lot myself.
I don't know.
You don't think it's enjoyable?
It's enjoyable. I think it's enjoyable when the book's done.
Well, yeah,
it's
I think
enjoyable when I hold the book in my hands. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Even in my nonfiction. I often write about, I write about sensitive things by mystic saints and sages. I write about, I don't write hagiographies, and yet I write about, beings that people hold very dear and are often on a pedestal. And, you have to write it in such a way that it is honest and accurate, but also readable and entertaining, because you don't want it to read like a phone book. So even when you're writing nonfiction, these are all things to... it depends what kind of writing you're doing, because if you're an academic writer, you don't have to worry about those things. You have other concerns.
Well, what I would say is, let me perhaps I'll clarify my statement. I think that writing is fun when you get that idea and you want to, and there's a certain jolt that you get, a little bit of that, excitement that comes along, that sort of that caffeinated rush you get when you get that little bit of
absolutely. Absolutely.
It's just great.
Absolutely.
And you get that idea and it starts rolling out, and you don't know where you're always going when you're writing.
No. Yeah, it takes on a life of its own.
Mm-hmm. And I love that.
Sometimes, it's I think when you're onto something, though, because all of a sudden it does sort of take a leap into the beyond, and you're like just holding on.
Mm-hmm. And of course, as a writer, you have to stop and say, where am I going with this? How's it going to turn out? Who's my character?
Yeah.
Is it going to be readable? Yeah. There's a lot of things you have to take into it. But it's an interesting... I think you've got to be a good observer. You've got to understand character, and you've got to understand people. You've got to understand situations and scenes. You've got to have that unusual twist that no one expects in there. You've got to get all these components have to be part of what it takes to make it. And I think that in many cases, the story you mentioned, the short one by the guest, there, you've got probably 500 and maybe 700 words, maybe at best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in there, you're getting in and out, and you're still left. And that is just craft in itself.
Yes.
You can't.
Yes. Yes. And he's a master storyteller, Lord Dunsany. He knew what he was doing. He wanted to set it up as a mystery. You weren't going to know what happened until the end. And
And that's the joy of it. That's that
Yeah.
when you get that aha moment. It's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And that is not an easy task. He may have written 5 times as many words before he got to that spot. Who knows? You just go with something, and they're like little jewels that come out of you, and you get them on page, and it's wonderful. But it certainly is a wonderful collection of books. It's called The Fantastic and Forgotten, Tales of the Supernatural, Strange, and Bizarre, edited and also introduced by Judika Illes, my guest today. So we've been talking about this fascinating collection. I think that if I could do anything to my children or my pending grandchildren, I would, force the idea of them, or at least encourage them to read more, because I think there's really nothing that comes close to that in our lifetime, especially now. I mean, I know we're all in this swirl together, this sort of this electronic swirl, and it does overtake our lives, but we don't really get that glimpse of what humanity is in our life. We just get these snippets that just come through, and these little digital flashes that we get, and news things flashing across the screen. We're almost bombarded to the point where we're beginning to forget things, I think. And
yeah, I think so. Or you lose. It is like a vertigo. You lose perspective.
You lose perspective. We're in like this. Yeah, it's a swirl.
It's overwhelming.
It's overwhelming. Yeah, it's a swirl of information, and we don't even know where to turn. And a lot of it, I think, is distractions. There's no question about it. It is very distractible, and there's a certain juice to it. I mean, you get where you're reading something. If you don't get a new headline in the next day or two, you check the New York Times. You keep refreshing the page. What's happening? And
I go to Twitter and I look to see what's trending.
Okay, that's a good idea. Yeah, uh-huh.
I look to see what's trending, and sometimes it makes me nervous.
Yeah, no, I can imagine.
It may turn out to be nothing, but sometimes it makes me nervous.
Yeah, no, it certainly is, and that's sort of what's following along that digital channel. It's just sitting there floating along, or trying to pick out what's going on. But I think it is a distraction. I've talked about it quite a bit on my radio show, and I don't mean to be disparaging of the digital technology. I think it's great, but it does.
No, it's wonderful.
It does draw us away.
But it's a double-edged sword. I mean, I couldn't. I have a series, for people who are not familiar with my work. I have a series of 4 very large, popular encyclopedias, and I mean, when I say large, the largest is the 2 largest are over 1,000 pages. Without the digital access, to the internet, and the ability to communicate with people far away without sending a letter and waiting for a return, maybe I would have written one in a lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true.
It does give us access and abilities to things we didn't have before, but it also, it's a rabbit hole that
It's a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And I think the book is the best way to sort of pull yourself out of the rabbit hole. We've been talking today with Judika Illes. She's the editor and wrote the introduction to The Fantastic and Forgotten, Tales of the Supernatural, Strange, and Bizarre. And I'm going to close up this with a quote from you in the back of the book, which I think really sort of summarizes this perfectly, and sort of is a good capstone for our conversation. It says, "While wonderful if read silently, the tales reveal their nuances, humor, and suspense with even more potency if read aloud. During the dark, eerie hours, when the wind is blowing and the ghosts are roaming outside, the night can be filled with a pleasant terror." I love that. Perfect way to end it. The book is The Fantastic and Forgotten, Tales of the Supernatural, Strange, and Bizarre, edited and introduced by Judika Illes, my guest today. I encourage you to check Judika's work out anywhere you go. Her last name is Illes, I-L-L-E-S, Judika, J-U-D-I-K-A. I encourage you to check out her work. She's written fantastic books on spells and all kinds of large tomes, encyclopedias on the supernatural and the esoteric, and it's always great to talk to you, Judika, and I always enjoy your work, and I hope you can keep doing it.
Me too. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks so much for coming on today.
Always
and
a
again,
pleasure.
The Fantastic and Forgotten by Judika Illes. Look into it, folks. You will not regret it, and you'll get your head out of your damn phone when you're doing it, too, so it's even better. So there we go. Okay, Judika, take care.
Thank you, Chris.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.